I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we look forward to what might happen on Thursday in Istanbul, after Zelensky challenged Putin to meet for prospective peace talks and Trump called for a meeting now. We discuss whether Putin will show up at all. We also dive into a potential new round of sanctions if Russia doesn't agree to a ceasefire, what they would target, and whether Europe can deliver on its promises. Finally, Francis has a robust conversation with the Hungarian Secretary of State for International Communication and Relations, Zoltán Kovács, at the Hungarian Embassy in London.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 13th of May. 3 years and 79 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by Associate Editor for Defence Dom Nicholls and Brussels Correspondent Joe Barnes. And before we turn to the diplomatic updates on such a pivotal week, Dom, can you catch us up on what's happening at the front?
Yeah, thanks, Adélie. Hello, everybody. Not quite as monumental the last 24 hours as those diplomatic manoeuvrings over the weekend, but I will come on to them in a minute. There have been some updates that we need to keep track of, so I'll cover those in just a second. But firstly, let's go into Ukraine and Russia on the ground. Very little movement is the overall headline. What there was yesterday was in the Donbass, around the Toretsk area, Russia continuing that push. That really does seem to be their main effort at the moment, the Donbass, and particularly that area to the sort of north of the Donbass, really pushing hard there. That probably accounts for most of the 1,070 Russian casualties yesterday. That stat comes from Ukraine's general staff, who, as I say, over the years have been taken to be generally reliable on this. However, a little bit to the north of Toretsk, and some reporting from the Institute for the Study of War says that Russia has reportedly deployed a largely ceremonial regiment of the FSB, the Federal Security Service, deployed them to the front line in Donetsk Oblast, likely in an effort, ISW say, to generate fear of a more rapid advance by Russian forces. Now, a spokesperson of a Ukrainian brigade operating around Chasiv Yar said yesterday that elements of the so-called elite Russian FSB Presidential Regiment are reinforcing Russian forces attempting to seize Chasiv Yar and the wider area. Now, the ISW says that this regiment reports directly to Putin and is primarily responsible for fulfilling honour guard duties at state functions, as well as guarding Russian officials, the Kremlin, and the eternal flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier. That's just on the western side of the Kremlin wall. Now, ISW has not previously observed the regiment operating in Ukraine, but they do note that Russian state media reported in 2014 and 16, so a little while ago, but probably still reasonably accurate about this unit, saying that the unit is about the size of a motorised rifle brigade consisting of conscripts and contracted soldiers. Now, I'm not sure about that fear thing, trying to just generate fear that they call the big guys up. I think they are just there to make up more numbers. As we said, that Russia's really struggling for numbers and just needs warm bodies to shove into the meat assaults. Russian state media suggest the presidential regiment likely lacks the training and combat experience necessary to successfully reinforce Russian operations near Chasiv Yar and the longer-term effort to seize that Ukrainian fortress belt in the Donetsk Oblast that Francis Farrell spoke so eloquently about yesterday. Do have a listen to yesterday's very granular updates for exactly why that area is probably getting Russia's main attention right now. I think that's largely what it is. If they're lacking training and combat experience, I think they're just there as meat rather than anything more substantial. Elsewhere, quieter night last night than the couple following the end of Russia's self-declared ceasefire. Only 10 Russian drones fired at Ukraine last night, all of them shot down. However, wider attacks pretty much across the whole of the sort of northeast and the south of the country did kill 2 and injure 7. And that's basically it for the military updates, Adélie.
Thanks, Dom. Now we're all kind of expectantly waiting for what's going to happen on Thursday in Istanbul. Where are we at since yesterday's episode?
Yeah, thanks. So it looks like Putin won't be going to Turkey for that meeting on Thursday. Let's just take a little step back and remind ourselves what we're talking about here. So Russia had the self-declared 3-day ceasefire to protect the Friday's Victory Day parade, as you'll remember. After that, President Zelensky said, well, come on, then let's roll straight into a 30-day ceasefire. If it was an act of goodwill, as you say, on your part, to have that 3-day ceasefire, well, let's have even more goodwill. Let's roll into a 30-day ceasefire. Of course, Putin rejected that. However, trying to get on the diplomatic front foot, Putin then called for direct negotiations on Thursday in Istanbul, putting the sort of diplomatic ball back over the net, so to speak. Donald Trump then got involved. He backed that idea of direct negotiations in Istanbul on Thursday. He didn't lend any support, didn't actually mention the proposed 30-day ceasefire, thereby undermining Ukraine and those and the European leaders' efforts. Remember, they were in, so Zelensky, Starmer, Merz were in Ukraine on Friday when this 30-day proposal came up. So Trump saw, his actions basically undermined those Western leaders, including Ukraine, and it was seen that a bit of a diplomatic win for Putin. However, then President Zelensky made the rather bold diplomatic move of saying that he would go personally. Zelensky, would be in Istanbul on Thursday. He said he would be expecting to see Putin there for direct talks for leader to leader. This was clearly a challenge to Putin. Now, yesterday, the Russian Federation Council Deputy Speaker Konstantin Kosachev said that Zelensky's invitation was, quote, pure spectacle and comedy. He said high-level meetings such as those proposed for Thursday are not organised in, quote, such a difficult situation. Although it was Putin's idea. I know, I can hear you thinking. Anyway, that was then followed by more effort by Russian officials to lay the ground for Putin rejecting this idea of a face-to-face meeting. That's clearly the phase we're in at the moment. So what have we seen? State Duma Committee on International Affairs Deputy Chairperson Alexei Chepa, he insinuated that Russia cannot trust Ukraine in any negotiations. Then Russian Ambassador at Large Rodion Mishnik questioned President Zelensky's intentions behind that invitation to meet Putin in Istanbul. The intention, I would have thought, would be fairly obvious, to have the talks that Putin, had called for on, checks notes, only Sunday. Anyway, this is all a bluff. They've been caught out diplomatically. They are attempting to show Donald Trump that they are serious about peace, whilst not being serious about peace at all. Putin cannot agree to meet Zelensky face to face, as that would legitimize him as a leader and Ukraine as a sovereign country. Putin is trying to completely sideline Ukraine and say, look, it's just the big boys. It's just Russia and America that will sort this out, and you just get what you're given, kind of thing. So he absolutely cannot. So the more the focus goes on, well, why aren't you going to these talks that you called for and Zelensky signed up to straight away, the more of a difficult bind he's in. And what is he most terrified of? He's most terrified of Donald Trump turning up in Istanbul, as he said he might, on the way back from his 4-day visit to the Gulf. More of that in a moment. So if Trump turns up in Istanbul with Zelensky in town somewhere and no Putin, how's that going to look? That's what the Kremlin are wrestling with at the moment. So expect to hear a lot more chat from the Kremlin this week about how, yes, they're massively up for these face-to-face meetings, and of course they want an end to this dreadful war, but it will take months to get into any position of the leaders' meeting. Now, working towards that goal, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, speaking in the last day, he didn't say Putin would go, but he said, quote, overall, we remain committed to a serious effort toward a long-term peaceful solution. And if you believe that, then I have a car to sell you. Peskov has updated that statement this morning by saying Russia will announce its representative for Istanbul once Putin deems it necessary. So, play for time, fudge, try and work out how to get some sort of diplomatic way out of this hole that they've put themselves into. However, moving on, just like a stopped clock that tells the correct time twice a day, perhaps Zaporizhia Oblast occupation official Vladimir Rogov has let the cat out of the bag. He was speaking yesterday, and he said that President Zelensky is trying to co-opt the ongoing discussion about negotiations by inviting Putin to Istanbul and making Putin seem intransigent if he does not attend. Like, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you've absolutely nailed it there, Vladimir. That's exactly what's going on. Putin is going to look intransigent and unserious, shall we say, about these negotiations if, having made great song and dance about it, he doesn't attend. Okay, so officially, the Kremlin has not yet confirmed who it will send, but we do know that Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, has been holding talks with his Turkish counterpart, including up to late last night, to discuss what's going to happen on Thursday. In his evening address last night, President Zelensky said that he was ready to meet Putin. It would be the first time they had met since 2019. And he criticised Putin's strange silence over whether he will attend. President Zelensky said Russian shelling and assaults continue. Moscow remains silent all day regarding the proposal for a direct meeting, a very strange silence. One way or another, Russia will have to end this war, and the sooner the better. A senior Ukrainian official said that Zelensky's made it clear he will only meet with Putin on Thursday and not any other lesser-ranking Russian officials. Now then, what will happen if Zelensky turns up without Putin, and maybe even Donald Trump turns up as well? European allies, we are told via Bloomberg reporting, will lean on the US to impose tougher sanctions on Russia if Putin doesn't attend. But they are currently holding back on pushing Donald Trump too far with the rhetoric in the days ahead, as they're going to wait to see for the Kremlin's answer on whether or not Putin's actually going to turn up. Now, Donald Trump, as I said earlier, he's in Saudi Arabia now on his 4-day visit to the Gulf, still in his own choice of clothing, actually, in a suit, not showing the cultural respect to his hosts of adopting their preferred choice of clothing, a dishdasher, a custom we would have expected after that Oval Office spat when people were demanding of Zelensky, why aren't you wearing a suit? Do you even own a suit? Anyway, Trump has not said anything more about Thursday's proposed meeting beyond what he offered yesterday before getting on the plane, when he said that he was thinking about flying to Turkey for the peace talks after Saudi Arabia, Qatar and the UAE. Now, Trump's focus, and I use that word advisedly, is expected to be on the war in Gaza and the threat of Iran's nuclear program. But let's just see if he goes via Istanbul on his way home and quite what that will do on the diplomatic front. And that's us pretty much up to date, Adélie.
Thank you very much, Dom. Now we're welcoming Joe Barnes, our Brussels correspondent. Joe, you've been following all of these latest developments about this very moving guest list of who's going to be in Istanbul on Thursday from Brussels. What's the view from over there?
Yeah, so really interesting. Let's first look at the American perspective. Dom sort of alluded to sort of the Marco Rubio maneuvers. Would Donald Trump turn up? But actually, the readout of a phone call last night between the Turkish foreign minister and Marco Rubio is really fascinating. This is attributed to spokeswoman Tammy Bruce. It says the secretary thanked Turkey for hosting and facilitating Russian and Ukraine direct negotiations and welcomed the possibility of an immediate ceasefire. You think that, plus what Donald Trump was saying yesterday, even if he's just saying I might pop in, is really upping the ante. I believe America generally think that Zelensky is going to be sitting down with a Russian official of some magnitude, of some seriousness. Whether it's Putin or not, we don't know, probably not. The US generally think there's going to be some talk. So it's a slight break, and this is how it's being perceived in Europe and sort of this side of the channel, and I'm guessing in the UK as well. It's perceived as a slight break from what was agreed in Kyiv over the weekend when Starmer, Britain's Prime Minister, Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, Emmanuel Macron, French President, Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister, travelled to Kyiv to meet Zelensky. And they spoke with Donald Trump as a group and agreed that for peace to happen, Russia first has to agree to a 30-day unconditional ceasefire, and that would then usher in the period of diplomatic negotiations. But Putin, as Dom said, upended that offer, sort of threw it on its head by saying, look, no, I'm just going to sit down and have talks. And Donald Trump played into his hands and said, well, Zelensky should immediately go to Turkey and hold these talks. So there's a bit of annoyance on that side and in Brussels, in other European capitals, that sort of the deal that they made and Trump backed in their eyes has been sort of ripped up in front of them. As Dom reported in Bloomberg, they're basically holding back. They don't want to pull the trigger on anything yet because it might upset. And I believe this is sort of the American attitude towards things. So again, Marco Rubio has spoken with the foreign ministers of France, Germany, Poland, and the UK, as well as the Ukrainian foreign minister, and Kaja Kallas, who's the EU's top foreign diplomat. They've all spoken probably to outline what's going on in Turkey. And from there, they've essentially been from given a seat at the table, have almost probably been relegated again as Russia proposes these direct talks before any hint of a ceasefire. But you can expect the Europeans will be sort of hammering home the message. Donald Trump agreed this while our leaders all spoke on the telephone. This is the way it has to go. It has to be ceasefire first, then peace talks. Don't let Russia get its own way by giving it more concessions, whether it be on blocking Ukraine from NATO, etc., which the Europeans were so put out with when the talks first happened between the US and Russia.
Do you want to talk us through the potential next round of sanctions that the EU, the UK and the US have been talking about? If Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire, what would these sanctions include, for example?
I think that's interesting. So there's lots of things that Europe, the UK and America can do. They can target more shadow fleet vessels, the boats that's being used by Russia, sort of under the radar to transport oil, sanctioned oil, around circumventing current sort of Western sanctions on oil exports. There are more banking sanctions to be had. There are opportunities to sanction things like Russian fertilizer exports, which have sort of been put off of the table by Europe, by America, because it's not normal to sanction things that help food production. And there's lots of sanctions to be had. But basically what I wrote was, have Kyiv's allies made a promise that they can't deliver? So France's Macron, Poland's Tusk, Germany's Merz basically have made this promise they can't really deliver. In Kyiv, they said that they would back massive sanctions against Russia if Vladimir Putin doesn't sign up to the 30-day ceasefire in the near future. The problem here is they don't appear to have backing for that move in Brussels. So on Monday, yesterday, EU ambassadors representing the bloc's 27 member states sat down to discuss sanctions against Russia, but at no point did they speak through the deal that had been brokered in the European capital between France, Britain, Poland, Germany, Ukraine and America. Sources told me, The Telegraph, that ambassadors instead only discussed a 17th round of sanctions, which have been on the table for a number of weeks, but nothing that actually delivers sort of the scale that is being promised to force Putin to the negotiating table. As it stands, not all member states, mainly probably Hungary, doesn't support the current 17th package being considered. You've got to remember, Britain has only just delivered what it's claimed to have been its largest package of sanctions to date. Has it got more up its sleeve? We don't know. So basically, the noise around sanctions behind the scenes doesn't really create the sense of jeopardy needed to convince Putin to finally come to the peace negotiation table. And look, and if I can find out, the Russians will have well-placed moles in and around European capitals that they will be able to get this information out with. So maybe that's the reason why Putin isn't actually too serious about Istanbul. But I'm currently trying to make arrangements to get there. So hopefully I'll be able to dial in and sort of report from what could be a historic day. It's either going to be Zelensky stood up by Putin in a Istanbul coffee bar on his own, which then he will have to go to Europe, he will have to go to America and say, look, you've made this agreement, you've promised to sanction Putin to the hilt. He then does run the risk that also by not meeting whoever Russia does send, I'm sure Russia will send someone because they're going to always be playing for time when it comes to Donald Trump. And if Zelensky refuses to meet a Lavrov or maybe a Kirill Dmitriev or someone like that who's been involved in the negotiations with America before, Trump could easily turn on him and say, look, well, the Russians did turn up. They sent someone senior. You didn't speak with them. So it's a real game of diplomatic chess going on at the moment. And I'm sure the Europeans will be in Donald Trump's ear. If it's not his, there'll be a Marco Rubio, other interlocutors, basically saying, look, it has to be Zelensky and Putin. It's got to be top level, like really trying to sort of build that narrative that it's actually Putin that is the blockage to peace and not Zelensky.
Thanks, Joe, and we really look forward to your updates on Thursday if you manage to get there. One last question on sanctions, and that's going to be my last question for today, is that dissenting voice in Europe on sanctions, which has been Hungary. Do you want to give us an image of the state of the conversation between the EU and Hungary on that topic, on sanctions? What is the tension there and what are they trying to do?
You've currently got the 17th round of sanctions going through, and while Hungary's never blocked a package of sanctions, it's always basically called for them to be watered down. It would argue that certain people, certain individuals shouldn't be included on the sanctions list. Certain companies shouldn't be included on the sanctions list. And it just basically proves to be difficult rather than a complete blockage. The current sanctions, it doesn't really focus on individuals or businesses, but what it does do is it takes the number of shadow fleet vessels that the EU sanctioned up to 200. That's if they're agreed. And we're expecting them to be agreed sort of today, tomorrow, by the end of the week. But what we do have is an upcoming date of July 31st, and that is when the EU's sanctions regime essentially against Russia essentially expires. These sanctions are in place and signed off every 6 months. And basically, at the moment, Hungary is once again saying, look, we're not going to sign off on this. And this deal package extension deal does need the unanimity of every 27 member states. And they're basically saying, look, we don't believe that you're conducting these sanctions in good faith. They're not aimed at getting Putin to the negotiating table. They're warmongering in themselves. And basically, EU member states are slightly worried that finally, after over more than 3 years, so it'll be, is it a sixth extension, seventh extension maybe? I can't remember off the top of my head, that Hungary might finally reject the rollover of these sanctions. And for that, there are various different workarounds being looked at. There's potential for an intergovernmental agreement, which would basically see a promise by the agreed 26 member states, so EU minus Hungary, to basically continue enforcing these sanctions on a domestic basis, as they kind of have to do anyway. That's how they're done. And then the other option is the EU's lawyers are looking at whether they can change the legal basis of these sanctions. Can they say we're not doing it under the current sort of legal order, but we're doing it under this order? And there is some thinking that actually having a play around with that might be able to change the voting mechanism to something called a qualified majority vote, QMV, which basically requires a majority of EU countries based on their size, their population. So basically, if France and Germany back it, it only needs one or two smaller countries to support it, and then they have that much needed number. So yeah, lots of manoeuvring going on. But I think also in Brussels, there is a slight belief that if Putin and Zelensky don't meet, that Europe convinces Donald Trump that Putin is the blockage to the peace talks, to this ceasefire that he's been pushing, that they can convince him to say, Europe, you need to, as promised, pick up sanctions on Russia to get Putin to the table. And at that point, the Hungarians, as previously said, would basically come on board and align with those sanctions because they're backed by Donald Trump rather than Europe.
Thank you, Joe. Staying on the topic of Hungary, over to Francis for a special interview.
Under Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, Hungary has maintained a cautious, often controversial stance on the war. While a member of both the EU and NATO, the government has pushed back against sanctions on Russia, citing economic harm to Hungary. It's also opposed EU efforts to provide military aid to Kyiv and has delayed related decisions many times. This morning, I went to the Hungarian embassy here in London to sit down with Zoltán Kovács, the Hungarian Secretary of State for International Communication and Relations. A close ally of the Prime Minister and a regular at cabinet meetings, he lays out Hungary's stance on Ukraine and on Russia. Among many other topics, he argues against labelling Putin a war criminal, casts doubts on reports of Russian war crimes, and claims that Western disinformation poses a greater threat than anything from the East. He also criticises what he sees as Europe's naive handling of the war and outlines how Hungary may approach the EU's latest sanctions package, one many fear Budapest will block. This is our robust conversation. Ukrainian authorities claim to have busted a Hungarian spy ring operating on its territory, alleging your government was collecting sensitive military data with one eye on a possible future incursion into the west of the country. How do you react to that?
Well, with all due respect, I see that actually being spread on X as we speak. So allegedly Hungarian vehicles rolling up from carriers and heading to the border. It's very unfortunate that Ukrainian authorities have chosen a different way in trying to convince Hungary what's the proper way for Ukraine to be and how Hungarians should behave. It's not only because of the war didn't make it better, but we've seen that happening for the past 10 years by now. So let's put it straightforward. Very meaningfully, the Ukrainian state was going against Hungarian minority rights. Hungarian minority was living in the Carpatho-Ukrainian region for 1,000 years. history has been very rough with them, seeing the borders coming and going, belonging to Czechoslovakia, belonging to Hungary, belonging to Russia, Soviet Union, belonging to Ukraine, and so on. So using the Hungarian minority for this kind of political and secret service purposes is certainly not the way that is going to convince us that we shall support Ukraine's accession to the European Union, with all the other issues on the table and all the problematic issues on the table. So you have to be very careful about disinformation, misinformation coming from Ukraine.
Can you just summarise what the attitude of the Hungarian government to Ukraine is?
First of all, I believe the Hungarian position is very much based on that basic principle that is accepted by everyone, and that is, if someone, a state, would like to become a member of the European Union, it has the right for that. We recognize that right. But also, we recognize the rules, and that is that the treaty past decades behind us, including the accession talks of Hungary and the Central European countries, are part of a story and part of a set of rules which suggest that any accession procedure should be merit-based, and that is, the state who is willing should be prepared to become a member. And we all know that Ukraine is not even close in any chapter or any elements of its existence actually to become part of the European Union. Apart from that, because of the actualities on the ground, the raging war, the uncertainties how the post-war settlement is going to look like, we definitely say no to Ukraine's membership in the European Union. It's neither prepared nor the political, economic, geopolitical environment is making it possible that Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union.
I'll come more to the EU in a moment, but I was talking more broadly than just the issue of Ukraine in the EU. I was talking about what is your attitude to a country that has been invaded by Russia?
Yes, indeed. There's another country actually who can tell a long story about how being invaded by Russia or the Soviets looks like. It is Hungary.
1956.
So we see that Ukraine is fighting a heroic war. There's no question that Hungary has been explicit on who's the aggressor here. But that doesn't change our attitude, and that is, if you wanted to have good bilateral relations, if you wanted to have a country which is, in brackets actually, is running its biggest humanitarian help operation towards Ukraine ever. So we have spent tens of billions of Hungarian forints for those coming to Ukraine. We've set up Ukrainian schools you wouldn't find anywhere in Europe. We've been providing humanitarian aid on a daily basis in all parts of Ukraine by our charity organizations. So instead of that recognized, we are being pushed and we are being blamed and hammered by a different opinion coming from Ukraine. So they never accepted that Hungary is never going to provide weaponry and never let weapons go through its territory to Ukraine, because we have a very strong mandate at the last general elections, which happened basically in the midst of the war as it started. And the mandate is clearly no to these things. Even if the government would be willing to do that, the democratic mandate, through which received a constitutional majority in the Hungarian parliament, says completely the opposite, and that is no to military aid and the involvement of Hungary in a war that shouldn't have started. So the Ukrainians have chosen a very intriguing way to handle the war in communications, in political attitudes, and in bilateral relations, which is not helping the relations, because blaming and attacking and spreading false information about Hungary certainly is not going to help. And definitely in the set of criteria we would like to see on the ground, if it's about bilateral relations, minority rights, only one element actually of the whole package. We are talking about energy security, blackmailing Hungary with cutting the ties, the existing pipe and gas lines actually with Russia, the only supply lines for Hungary, which is existential for the country, are not the way actually we are going to have a better relationship with Ukraine.
I don't wish to misquote you, but you're suggesting that we need a pragmatic relationship with Putin. But how on earth can one have a pragmatic relationship with somebody who has carried out the war crimes that we've seen in Ukraine?
And I'll give you a good example. The American president has just shaken hands, and President Macron just received the head of the new Syrian administration, who is a proven mass murderer. So apparently there are no moral problems with other people. So, but again, what I've called out, we had a discussion earlier, indeed, you need a minimum amount of respect towards the other party, even if it's a war. and have to recognize that there are different perspectives on a conflict, or a set of conflicts actually, that came to a war in Ukraine. If you don't have a basic attitude, it's very difficult to talk about any kind of meaningful negotiations or an approach to truce and eventually to peace. And that's what the Hungarian government is talking about. Again, this is not taking sides, this is not accepting what allegedly, maybe proven way, the Russians did in Ukraine or during the conflict, but you also have to look at the other side and handle the issues in a, as you called it, a pragmatic manner. For Hungary, for obvious reasons, and we've been blamed and called friends of Russia for that. A proper and a respectful relationship with Russia for reasons of energy security and many other elements, including nuclear, is a must. How can you expect a little bit of partnership from the other party if you have only blaming and ideological language always used against the one actually wanted to talk? Now, this is a lesson actually Western European leaders, I believe, should learn. If you wanted to have a new chapter about relationship with Russia and the chance to settle the conflict, that attitude change should come.
What do you think happened in Bucha?
The best thing I can answer is that we still don't know exactly. We have many reports. You suggested that you personally have been there. We have seen Hungarian and other journalists going there, and we see one side of the story. I believe what we can ask for, and that's what the Prime Minister was asking for, is an independent, thorough investigation what really happened in Bucha. And eventually, when we have all the information available, let's make it happen. Take it to the court. Let's talk about it in a manner when we know all the details and all the narrative elements actually coming from both sides.
I have to press you on this. Bucha is but one example of copious examples of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. And I put to you that the United Nations has just published a report. Indeed, I had one of the authors on this very podcast articulating the scale of those that take place. So nobody is denying that in war all sides commit crimes, but there is something particular going on, he said, because of the scale of those war crimes. But you seem very hesitant to acknowledge that there have been systematic, and that's the word that was used, systematic war crimes committed by the Russians in Ukraine.
All right. I can only repeat what the fact is, and that is, this is not going to change the fact that it's only a one-sided report, because nobody talks to the Russians for the past.
It's the United Nations.
But still, it doesn't make it non-existent that since they don't talk to the Russians, and you don't have a different perspective.
Well, they refuse. They approach. If I may, right. They approach the Russians copious times. They say this in the report. The number of times they approach them, and they refuse to engage.
And I believe the proper way is that finish the atrocities, have a truce, have a meaningful discussion about peace and eventually a peace treaty, and then try to unearth what happened in Ukraine on both sides. And I would like to repeat both sides, because we all know that there were different kinds of atrocities against the Russian minority, proven ones actually, nobody ever denied. And I believe if there's an investigation, that a thorough, fully comprehensive investigation in Ukraine, what happened. And blame those who committed that, and have a full picture of that. And we are very far from that.
Where do you stand on the idea of Putin being called a war criminal by European leaders, and indeed the special tribunal that European leaders are trying to...
But the use of that kind of political language is not going to help negotiations come in. A weaponized language is never a good advisor, actually, on issues. Just for the sake of facts, starting a war is not a war crime. You like it or not, maybe, even if it's against international law, the manner how the war, or the special operation, as the Russians called it, was started, still it will not change the fact that that itself is not a war crime. So if it was, then most Western European leaders would, or many Western European leaders actually for the past, will have to think about that. Starting a war is a war crime itself. So it brings back us to one topic we've been discussing, and that is language weaponized, and denominations and insults sent out in this manner is not going to help, or are not going to help negotiations and the proper conversation with the other party.
If I may, yes, you could say that, I mean, many people I think would question the idea whether invading a sovereign nation would make you a war criminal, but let's say it didn't. I could return to what I was saying, which is that the manner in which this war has been fought, many people would say is undeniable, in terms of the fact that war crimes are being committed, and as I say, the ICC said that Putin himself had to be held responsible for the kidnapping of thousands of children. I mean, how do you feel when you see your Prime Minister shaking hands with somebody who's by numerous reports, has been accused of systematically taking tens of thousands of children and re-educating them in Russia. That's genocidal behaviour, isn't it?
Very well, yeah. We are talking about your and some other people's opinion, and we would like to rely on facts. And shaking hands with someone, as just previously indicated, is just the minimal respect actually towards someone who you would like to have a conversation. And I think in politics, that's something you have to always keep in mind. Again, Hungary has always been on the side of reality, and the credibility of ICC in that respect is very severely undermined by what it was doing actually in Israel. So keep that in mind as well.
Let's change the subject. We were looking at the European Union earlier, and you alluded to it earlier on. What will Hungary do about the extension of the EU sanctions on Russia beyond July 31st?
We'll see. So it's too early to call. As a matter of fact, and it's not a matter of, not even a little bit of laugh, so what you heard is rather the consideration that that's the 17th package we are talking about. And very obviously the renewal of the basic ones you're referring to. And it's clear that the sanction policy is not working. They failed. They are causing more harm to the European economy and the European member states than to Russia. So it did not bring Russia to its knees. Russia has continued the war. As a matter of fact, as we see and everybody can see, it is winning this war at the moment. Certainly is not losing. And the sanction policies are causing more harm to the European member states, let me repeat that, than doing any good. By its impact on energy prices, 3-4 times Europeans pay for energy than, say, the Americans or the Chinese. In a global contest in which there's a complete reconfiguration, economic, geopolitical reconfiguration, and Europe would like to go for a renewed and more effective way of competing in the international arena. Competitiveness issue is there. It is impossible to talk about competitiveness if the basics, namely energy, is 3 times costing more for you than for your adversaries. So we have to keep that in mind. Apparently, that recognition is still not there in Brussels and in the Western European capitals.
You allude there that sanctions were only ever about bringing an implosion of the Russian economy, but many experts would say that this was about reducing the Russian capacity to fight. For example, you have sanctions that stall the ability for certain technologies to get into Russia, for instance. So on that metric, you could say that there have been some successes. I agree, not fundamental, perhaps, successes, but there have been some. But I wonder if Donald Trump told Hungary that he wanted you to carry on doing the sanctions, would you oblige him?
If you like, that's the theoretic level or dimension of sanctions. European sanctions are still being formulated and put on the table from the perspective and from the idea, or driven by the idea that Russia can be defeated and should be defeated. If it's about bringing Russia to the negotiation table and talking about peace, that's a different matter.
So you're saying that if it's about applying pressure on the Russians to bring about negotiations, that would be a very different conundrum?
That's exactly what the Prime Minister meant actually a couple of weeks ago when he announced that.
Mm-hmm. You're very critical of the European Union. I think that's fair to say in the way that it's conducted itself, and we can get into that in a moment. But I think many people will be asking, why are you a member?
Because that's the national interest of Hungary. So becoming a member, and we are members for 21 years this year, is very simple. The founding fathers wanted a continent, an integration process, if you like, which would help Europe to get rid of war and armed conflict and help the economic prosperity of all member states. Nobody ever imagined, and I believe that we believe that it remains the case, that integration is being forced and pulled into areas where there's definitely no need and there's no possibility to integrate. And with all due respect, before the Brits leaving the European Union, the United Kingdom was one of our most important allies, actually, in resisting that coming. And that was exactly the reason, actually, the UK left, because the Union, the European institutions are coming into areas, into parts of our lives where there's nothing to look for European. There's no such thing as European identity. That's a second identity. We are all Hungarians, Brits, English, French, Germans, and that's how we become Europeans. It is helpful, it's meaningful, we can agree, we have agreed on most content elements actually of that are included in the treaty, and we simply cannot accept that in face of national sovereignty and in face of the treaty, which is clearly deciding where the confines of institutional competence and member states' sovereignty are drawn, the intrusion is happening on a daily basis. So the European institutions, the Parliament and the Commission, on a daily basis basically are going around the established and existing rules and are bringing in or inventing a new set of measures actually. Namely, the last one actually is the proposal, the Repower Europe kind of proposal, which is basically going around the sanction policies in which we are very explicit. We never will agree on sanctions on those kind of energy sector elements actually which are existential for Hungary. This proposal is proposing detaching actually from Eastern European Russian natural resources on a permanent basis. Now that's a complete nonsense. If it's about diversification, the name of the game is that you have to establish as many possibilities actually for accession or accessibility to energy as possible. Cutting yourself off from one of the major, in the case of Central European countries, probably the only reliable resource of natural energy is just against the national sovereignty, certainly the energy sovereignty of those countries.
Earlier on, you also been very critical of the EU's foreign interference in Hungarian affairs. Can you just articulate your perspective on that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, many suggesting, and during the conversation, even you suggested that if it's about disinformation, misinformation, we should keep an eye on Russia. Yes, indeed. But in the case of Hungary, I'm sorry to say that not only two, but as many eyes we have should be kept on the western part of Europe, actually. It's a daily basis intrusion into our domestic politics, coming from Western European governments, coming from Brussels, coming from the European Parliament, from the Commission. And they are very explicit, actually, the People's Party, Mr. Weber, on telling who the next Prime Minister of Hungary is going to become. So if that's not an incursion into Hungarian domestic politics, what is an incursion to domestic politics? So in today's world, when the sources for information are very diverse and mostly unreliable, let's put it that way, you have to be very careful, actually, how you look at, how you regard, how you rely on these kind of information. And you have to be vigilant, not simply vigilant, but also outspoken if in face of the allegations that it's, say, Russian disinformation that is the major threat to Europe, you say that no, in the case of Hungary, it's not Russian disinformation, it's Western European political intrusion and disinformation that is posing the biggest threat.
You think that's the biggest threat facing Europe and Hungary is disinformation, from the West, not from
this moment for Hungary, it is definitely the People's Party and many in Brussels actually who are posing the biggest danger actually to Hungarian democracy.
Now, I was saying earlier on that I was asking you, J.D. Vance's speech, many of the critiques that he made would be in line with what you were saying, the speech that he gave at Munich. Can you just relay for this what your reaction to the Vance speech
I believe
was?
the Vice President's speech, which came as a surprise, I've seen it and I've seen the faces, were a summary of what not only Hungary but many others actually, especially from the political right, who's been put in the corner and accused with non-democratic, anti-democratic behavior, were trying to suggest, and that is that in the name of democracy, hijacking institutions, forbidding to say your own opinion, putting restraints on social media for ideological reasons is not the way Europe should be behaving. You have to respect the opinion of the people. And certainly when you see that it's not simply the so-called liberal version of democracy which is making it, but it is hiring NGOs, and the so-called civil society. It is so-called because it is not civil society. It's non-elected, not grassroots, and certainly not responsible for political purposes. This is exactly the world against which the Vice President was talking about. The name of democracy is very simple. You have to know the will of the people, and you cannot disregard it just because you don't like the way some talk. And when it's within the confines of your constitutions, and definitely we all believe that it is in all European countries and in the Western Hemisphere, it is the constitutions which decide about the lawfulness or the democratic nature of an existing party, of an existing content, political content you are talking about. You have to respect that. It is impossible, say, to tell you in Germany, that 1/5 of the population is being disregarded and basically excommunicated politically just because they speak a different language or have a different opinion.
But to many it will sound like you're very opposed to foreign intervention, unless it's from somebody who's intervening, as J.D. Vance was, from an ideological position that you agree with. Because was he not intervening in foreign affairs by critiquing the Germans so openly as he did and talking about the AfD and other countries in Europe?
Well, your remark would be legit if it was not referring to a completely different layer or dimension of what we are talking about. General remarks about what should be the basic principles of a Western-type democracy and concrete interference in domestic politics are two different things. And I think the vice president was talking about the philosophical level, and that is how Western political environment, the political culture we all believe in should look like, and not hijacked by the so-called liberal progressive elements. And that's what the Americans learned actually at a high price actually for the past 8 years actually behind us, how that can be derailed actually what we all believe is the Western type of democracy. So what's been done to the new president, Mr. Trump, is very telling about how legal, moral, NGO and all kinds of weaponry have been used against the party, previously democratically elected and again re-elected president actually, just to make it impossible to come back to power. And this is exactly happening in Europe. This is exactly happening in Europe, and it's a different matter when political party groups in the European Parliament, the head of the Commission, commissioners, basically tell you how you should behave, what you should be doing in your own country, where you have the legitimacy provided by the people, again, by a body which is has a secondary legitimacy elected by the heads of state. So seemingly it's all a confusion, but if you wanted to come back to the principles, the basic principles, it's very simple. You cannot disregard the will of the people, and this is what the Hungarian government is standing for the past 15 years.
I don't want to misquote you, but earlier on you were suggesting that the biggest existential threat that Europe, or the West even, faces is this sort of thing, this sort of hyper-liberalism or liberalism weaponized, as it were. You think that is more of a danger than the prospect of a Russia that has become increasingly military mobilized and also, many would argue, fascistic?
Yes, but these are the kind of opinions actually which disregard history. I suggest, I'm a historian myself, that you read more history, and you have to recognize that even in Europe or in the vicinity of Europe, political constructs, social reality is going to be different from what you experience here in the United Kingdom or even in Central Europe. And if you don't respect that, you're always going to fall in this trap actually that you use denominations, you use a rhetoric, you use a narrative which is making it impossible to understand what the others is representing and making you misinterpret actually and believe in misinterpretations instead of the reality on the ground. That only comes through, again, mutual respect and the recognition that the world was never meant to be what many believed during actually the so-called globalization age, the Western kind of globalization that is going to become, and that is everybody around the globe is going to believe and going to behave and going to live a life like in America or in the United Kingdom. That clearly is not going to happen. You have to recognize that the majority of the globe, as a matter of fact, so of the many, many billions of people, I believe over 2/3 are having different ideas. And if you don't recognize that, it's very difficult actually to come to a good conclusion.
I'm also a trained historian. Many would argue that it is a truism of history that unpunished evil grows. So how can one justify the rapprochement with Russia that your country has spearheaded in the last particularly couple of years since the initial shock of the invasion?
Whatever you mean by rapprochement, I can tell you that what driven the Hungarian diplomatic effort was ever, and as we call our grand strategy actually, it's called connectivity, and that is keep your mind, keep your economy open to all corners of the world. show respect towards all corners of the world as they are, is that was driving us actually vis-a-vis Russia. And again, you have to be very careful using words. If you're a historian, using the denomination fascist or Nazi has a very specific meaning. I see that mistake being committed on a daily basis. That
those are two different things.
Terms with specific meanings for the past are being used for the present and for the future. That's completely nonsense. That's completely nonsense. You cannot compare, and definitely the Russians are going to tell you, Russia to any kind of Nazi or fascist state, for sure. You probably can compare Russians to themselves, how Russia existed or how the Soviet Union existed before that.
But that's not what a historian does. A historian looks at all of different types of societies over human history and categorizes them based on certain metrics.
Sure thing,
and
but
I don't judge Russian history through the prism, or British history just through the prism of my own experience.
But
that's not what history is.
Nazism belongs to the Germans exclusively, I'm afraid. And fascism belongs to some certain Central European and South European countries before and during the Second World War. Don't use these terms for the 21st century because they're completely misleading, and in many respects would be a sign of ignorance towards historical fact. The reading of history is a very important thing. I'm a practicing politician, so I shouldn't be engaging in theoretical discussions, but very definitely it's no good for political rhetoric narratives to import and bring in denominations and terms which are completely misleading.
How would you define modern Russia then? What kind of society is it?
Russia is working according to the rules of Russia.
Do you think those rules are good?
It's not my personal or governmental authority to judge whether it's good for or not good. I believe if you ask some Russians actually if they think that it's good for or not, what do you do here in the UK or what we do in Hungary or what the Americans do, they will have their opinion.
What's the Hungarian attitude to 1956 and the crushing of the Hungarian uprising?
What it should be, what it always had been, more exactly, what was not accepted obviously by the communists who have crushed together with the Soviet Union the uprisal. That was a true uprisal, true revolution for proper democracy, crushed violently by Hungarian communists and their proxies, and that is the Soviet Union.
The tanks rolled in.
Killed
hundreds,
but at the same time, because I see that's going to come, drawing parallels with 56 and what is happening in Ukraine is completely misleading.
Go on.
That's it. I mean, why compare uncomparable things?
With respect, I asked what the attitude was towards 1956. I mean, among the population at large, or even amongst just on an individual level. I mean, this is a defining event. It was a defining event in the Cold War, so I don't think it's an unjust question to ask.
It is a question that shouldn't be put neither by you nor by myself or by the Hungarian government, because the anniversary of the revolution, the 23rd of October, is our national holiday. This is probably the most important national holiday, together with the 15th of March, which is commemorating another fight for freedom and independence, and the 20th of August, which is about the over 1,000 years of foundations for the Hungarian state. So I believe the memory, the importance, the relevance, and the organic survival of the sense and spirit of 56 is the basics for the Hungarian democracy you see today.
One final question, and then I'll open the floor for you to talk about anything that we've not touched on in my questions. When you look at the present European continent and its troubles and problems, are you optimistic about the future or are you pessimistic?
It is intriguing, in many respects bizarre, to see that what the Prime Minister was talking about for the past over a decade by now. And if you know the Prime Minister's speeches and announcements 2, 3, 4 times a year, including the so-called Tusványos Summer University, which is end of July yearly gathering of Hungarians in the Carpathian Basin, when the Prime Minister is always talking about strategic perspectives and taking the freedom of talking more like a scholar than a politician, have been calling out Europe and Europe's competitiveness for the past 15 years by now. We see the same numbers. We see the same tendencies. We see unavoidably coming and upcoming events. Still, many believe that the Prime Minister's vision is a utopia. But we see that that's a reality. Europe is losing ground if it's about Europe's share, say, in the world economy. Europe is losing ground if it's about population. Europe is losing ground if it's about competitiveness. Europe is non-existent if it's about military power, and so on. We've been calling out these facts actually for the past 15 years. And if not nothing, but next to nothing is happening actually on behalf of the leadership in the European Union or Western European leaders. So it's a very intriguing political reality behind us and ahead of us, as a matter of fact, that calling out these facts, reading the very same data and developments, is having different kinds of conclusions and mindsets actually in Europe. This is the same what we are talking about the war and what we are talking about, say, the future of Ukraine. So the accelerated acceptance of Ukraine to the European Union is a suicidal move. It's going to kill the European economy. It's not good for Europe, not until the countries are for those very essential and basic criteria all other countries have to fulfill actually before becoming members of the European Union.
Some people would say, though, that you're in danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that there are legitimate critiques to be made of Europe, its philosophy, its leadership of recent years, but what you're calling for, or perhaps even your actions indirectly, could trigger the implosion of much of the post-war architecture that has secured peace on the continent. Do you acknowledge that that's a legitimate risk here? I mean, for example, you were defending Vance's speech, but if the United States withdraws from Europe as a consequence of its actions, that can't be good for Hungary and its self-interest, and that can't be good for the continent either.
Yeah, but it's not going to happen because of Hungary, and it's not going to happen because of the patriotic voice gaining or regaining strength in Europe. It is going to happen because of the reality of geopolitics, and that is that you cannot live in the post-Second World War world anymore when even the Cold War has finished 40 years ago. So I believe many Western Europeans believe that things are never going to change and things are going to remain and stay like they were 30 years ago. In the face of the rise of China, or the rise of China, the rise of India, the coming of many other parts of the globe, with the very much higher growth tendencies and energy levels actually the Europeans have, as soon as the sooner you reconsider, the better it is for Europe, for all European countries.
And is there anything that we've not talked about that you'd like to?
I think we've been very comprehensive. Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Shall we go to final thoughts now? Dom, do you want to take it away?
Thanks, Adélie. So, interesting article, I think it was yesterday, I saw it online, from David Blair, our senior foreign commentator. It was entitled, "Whisper It, but it's just possible that sanity is returning to US diplomacy." So I think you kind of get where he's coming from. He's making the point that if you look at what's just happened in the last few days with Marco Rubio seemingly bringing India and Pakistan to some sort of, if not a table, then an accepted position about their fighting over the last few days. You got the China trade deal the US seems to have negotiated again, albeit 90-day cooling off period or whatever they're calling it. But yeah, there's some pretty big things happening in the last 72, 96 hours, that kind of thing. So David's written this piece, well worth a read. But I just ask you folks, what are your thoughts here? So it's 8 years since Donald Trump was last visiting the Gulf region as president. And things have changed. You know, how much has the landscape shifted in those 8 years? And I wonder if he is adopting the mentality that he had back then for a very changed landscape. If you look at, what are the Gulf states concerned about? Well, oil price and volatility, for one. And Donald Trump has not been, as far as they were concerned, he's been perhaps a bit unhelpful in that regard with the whole tariff thing. Secondly, war in Gaza, October the 7th. If you look at Trump, some of his more verbose claims about turning Gaza into some sort of Mediterranean glorious seaside resort, these are all exciting and lively tugs on the diplomatic lever. I'm not saying it isn't required now and again, but I just think from the Gulf point of view, if they're concerned that too agricultural use, shall we say, of these various mechanisms, without thinking through the second, third, fourth order consequences to them all, is going to introduce instability to a region that's gone through huge change in the last few years since Donald Trump was last in power. And I wonder if they would welcome that sort of volatility and welcome this more bellicose Trump 2.0 hit the ground very much running compared to Trump 1.0. Or whether or not they're looking for a bit of a shake of the snow dome. I'm just we'll be interested to see what comes out of it. But I would welcome your thoughts. Thank you.
And Joe, do you want to leave us with your final thoughts?
I would just say that Thursday could prove to be an absolutely huge day in diplomatic efforts around the full-scale invasion. It could prove to be a masterclass by Volodymyr Zelensky, him turning up, him agreeing to the Putin showdown and Putin not turning up. That could be a real pinnacle moment for the whole of this. It could actually sort of be the moment when we finally get Donald Trump backing Ukraine properly in these peace talks rather than sort of flirting more on the Russian position. But ultimately, it could also be a decisive moment for the Russians. If Trump, as he sort of flipped and flopped in the wind, if he decides that whether it be Lavrov or whatever Russian official turns up is senior enough to hold these talks with Zelensky, you've got to remember he sends a special envoy to hold talks with Putin, so he's no stranger of sort of the normal diplomatic protocols around who can meet who. When he sends Witkoff to Moscow to meet Putin, he doesn't mind the fact that a world leader is not speaking to another world leader, and these levels are maintained. So yeah, really interesting. Let's fingers crossed it doesn't backfire. I'm just trying to book my flights now, so hopefully I can dial in from Istanbul tomorrow and sort of give you an update of what I've seen.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free and then 2 months for just £1 at telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to the episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. And we also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly and ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. And you can also get in touch with us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.